All righty. Well, welcome to the Organic Advisor Call Series, everybody. It's good to see everyone. We're going to have some fun today. And as usual, this meeting is going to be recorded and it will be posted to the Organic Agronomy Training Services website and YouTube channel for your benefit and for those who could not attend live. So this will be recorded. And something that you may have noticed about me as we've started the call today is that I am not Sam Oswald Tilton, your normal host. Sam wasn't able to join us today, so he asked that I jump in as a guest today. So I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Ashley Adair. I'm the Extension Organic Agriculture Specialist at Purdue University. And I do a lot of outreach work with farmers, and I also connect farmers with researchers here at the university. And I'm also part of the Indiana Organic Network. So if you're here in Indiana, you may have seen some of the Indiana Organic Network events that we've been putting on throughout this summer. And then we have some events coming up in fall and winter. So we look forward to maybe seeing some of you there. I would also like to acknowledge Amanda Gullett, who is here with Oats and assisting on the call series today. So we're really grateful for her help in making sure that all of the technology of this call works as it is supposed to. So today's topic is organic soil fertility and how we can understand each farm situation and their different fertility needs. So we're really fortunate to be joined by James Schroepfer here today, and I'm going to introduce him here in a moment, but we have a few housekeeping items to sort out first. So first off, this series is brought to you by the Organic Agronomy Training Service, also known as OATS, and also Albert Lee Seed House. Albert Lee is a fourth generation family owned independent farm seed company with a full line of organic and non GMO field crop seed, as well as knowledgeable reps. Thank you to Albert Lee for your support of this series. So we'll put a link to their website in the chat for you to look at. So the Organic Agronomy Training Service, OATS, is a partnership between universities, agronomists, crop consultants, nonprofit educators, and industry reps from throughout the country. OATS is a collaboratively managed training program for the agricultural advisors like yourselves who work with organic farmers, transitioning farmers, and those organic curious farmers. We provide some science-based training for the people and businesses that support organic farmers. So if your organization is interested in any custom training on organic practices, please reach out to Oats. So this is our sixth episode of the Organic Call series this season. There are two entire past seasons of this series available on YouTube, and we can drop a link to that YouTube channel into the chat for you as well. Your feedback on these events is very helpful so that we can get some direction on bringing you information that you want to know. Oats will do a brief poll before the episode and a short survey after. So take a look in the chat for that link or for the poll to pop up. It should be showing up now on your screen. So if you can go ahead and take a look at that for us, that would be a great help. If you have any topics or speakers that you'd like to hear from in future seasons call series, this is a great place to put some of that information down as Sam is planning those series now. So that's all for housekeeping. So let's go ahead and get started with our discussion today. And I'll introduce you to our guest, James Schroepfer. So James is a certified crop advisor and an organic farmer located in central Minnesota. Growing up on a small 60-acre organic farm in northern Illinois, he worked on a number of different organic and conventional farms until going to South Dakota State University for agronomy. So he's trying to understand the scientific connection between crops, soils, and animal health while at university. After a number of years working as a private crop consultant, James and his brother bought into an organic crop and cow-calf operation. And in addition to crop consulting for farmers through Crop Fertility Services LLC, he currently farms 700 acres organically with his brother with a small beef herd. So we're going to start out by asking James a couple of questions. And we're going to start kind of big picture and then kind of funnel this conversation down into some of the more detailed ways that you might approach working with a farmer on an organic farm and understanding their farm and giving recommendations. So, James, there are a lot of details to consider when it comes to making recommendations on any farm, but especially on organic farms. So, let's kind of start with those. Like, how do you approach making some of those recommendations and looking at the big picture of what's going on somebody's farm when they first reach out to you?
Well, Ashley, and thanks for inviting me on here to discuss this. I would say the most common approach I get with growers is I meet them at a winter conference, maybe at a social event, maybe they are calling me knowing a current client I work with. And specifically, most growers reach out and they call about a individual problem on an individual field. The problem I see with organic is for the most part, the two foundational things that organically we use to address problems on a farm are long-term planning and big picture analysis to start with. So normally with a grower, I'll talk through a specific challenge they have, but to really do a good assessment and help them better their farm, better their system, better that field, it really comes down to sitting down, and normally it's a 3, 4, 5 hour discussion on their system as a whole. And then from there, once we have a big picture painted out, and look at their inherent strengths, weaknesses, advantages, system, rotation, crops, current yields, um, challenges on the farm, weed pressure, tools they have in their arsenal to manage those different challenges. Once we kind of pull all the details together, then it's a lot easier to start building out a system that is suited to their farm. I view every farm as its own unique system. Every farm has its own inherent strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges. And for me to come with a cookie cutter approach and just give somebody an answer, uh, if it's not practical to their system, it's not going to help them going down the road. So normally I start out with a very holistic analysis of their farm. I want to know inflows of nutrients, not just fertility, but we start looking at things like hay. Um, I've worked with I don't know how many different farms in the past, and the comment to me will be made, well, we don't buy any outside fertilizer. And I'll ask, well, do you grow all your own feed? No, we typically buy about 5, 8 loads of semi loads of alfalfa. Well, that's 5, 8 loads of fertility you just brought on your farm. And we don't think of it in those terms. But what I like to do is identify all those inflows and onto a farm, and then potential outflows. What are you exporting? Are you exporting milk off a farm? Are you exporting grain? And that helps me assess, how fast that's changing. And then what becomes useful is looking at, okay, what their particular soils and what their soils can sustain over time. Um, from there, oftentimes I'm trying to pull as much qualitative and quantitative information that I possibly can. What did the crop look like last year? Was there any discoloration? What are your challenges for weeds? What type of weeds? What's the pressure like? Is the different areas of the farm, does it have different challenges? From our own farm, for example, we farm a wide variety of different soils, everything from basically sugar sand to heavy ground, and I have irrigated ground, and there's no one rotation, one fertility system I applied to those different soils. Each one of them I attack differently. Each one of them have their own unique weed challenges. And so even the rotation across those fields, I try to tailor specific to trying to play as many strengths of the farm, of the field as I can to build a successful system for that farm.
It's a very comprehensive approach, which I think is necessary on any farm, but with organics, it becomes a little bit more complicated with some of the opportunities and limitations that come with those types of systems. Something I wanted to touch on that we've chatted a little bit about earlier today is kind of talking about the difference and maybe even the overlap between soil health and soil fertility. So, could you explain for our audience kind of what you view the differences between those two terms and maybe how farmers are approaching their fields with those two terms in mind?
I currently in the industry, because soil health was lacking in the conversation for 50 years. Um, its resurgence of importance has dominated our news cycle, if you want to call it that. And with that, it's almost overshadowed soil fertility as in something that it replaces, or soil fertility is not something that we have to pay attention to anymore. Soil fertility is the assessment of the soil and the nutrients that that crop that you're going to grow there needs. Can it supply it? Soil health is relative to how much of that environment can my crop explore, associate with, what are the supporting elements such as microbes, water, air in that system that can provide and support a healthy plant. So they're jointed though, very much so, because I use the analogy of like a swimming pool, and I throw quarters through, throughout the pool, but then I only give you 1/10 of a pool to go swim in and pick the quarters out. Well, the amount of quarters you're going to get from that resource then is diminished relative to the whole. And I throw that scenario out. You have a compacted soil, a soil that doesn't drain well, soil with poor air, poor microbe activity. You're limiting your access to your resources when you don't address your soil health to give yourself more of the pool to explore and get those quarters, those nutrients over time. So there is a correlation as far as I often see on the conventional side, and it's talked in the industry that we need higher soil test levels to support higher yields. Now, to a point, I've seen that good organic systems that have healthy soils, they can support excellent crop production at lower soil testing levels because they do have all those that wider area of the soil that those roots are exploring. When the root has to expend a lot of energy to work through compacted layers and then it's waterlogged, you're not tapping into the resource of your own soils on your farm.
Are you finding this conversation useful? Hit the thumbs up button to help others discover it too. And if you'd like more conversations like this, click subscribe and turn on the bell icon for notifications.
To do. What do you look at as an agronomist as some good indicators? So maybe something on a soil test that can help you understand whether that soil might be ready to be able to grow a healthy crop.
Most of the time when I get introduced to a farm, it's in the wintertime. So it gets a lot more difficult to do a good assessment of a farm, which is why, for my part, I enjoy being able to get out and actually work with my individual growers through the season and watch that crop, see their soils over time. Um, there's a lot of different tests out there, the Haney being one of them. Particularly in the Haney, you have the Sovita test in a numerical value, a soil health metric. I still have found nothing that will replace the shovel currently. Getting out in your fields, digging around, looking for earthworms, smelling the soil, seeing how the crop roots are growing through that soil. That truly, if you, as a farmer, if you want to know how healthy your soil is, those are the indicators that are foundationally what I'm going to look for from a soil health standpoint. Um, there are other aspects that a farm in the wintertime, if I don't have that opportunity to get on their fields prior to working with them, that would be indicative of that as far as poor drainage, fields compacted all the time, the tillage. And so I try to take into all consideration all the information I can possibly get from the farm as where that soil currently is at in helping them starting to improve their systems going into the next year. Um, it normally takes a couple years working with the farm to help dial that in. It's very easy from the conventional side because they don't really value or haven't to date really valued soil health. So it was a cookbook recipe. Oh, you're low in potassium. We'll just put more potassium fertilizer on there. Oh, you have a lot of disease pressure. We'll have to go to a second or a third fungicide application. You're looking more at pigeonholed responses. In organic, we don't really have an availability of quick response materials, however you want to view the conventional alternatives. So for us, it really is foundationally, again, ground on that long-term planning. And I have to address those issues long-term via what's my rotation? Can I introduce cover crops? Can I introduce another crop into that rotation to deal with some of those challenges well on a farm? The other thing I look at is tillage practices. Am I over-tilling? Am I setting myself up for failure by not doing any mitigating practices for that aggressive tillage maybe I had to do the previous season in my soybean crop? So all those things lead to ultimately and build out the challenges that you're going to see the next year. The problem is on the conventional side, we've been trained to be reactionary. We see a weed, we kill it with a herbicide. Versus organically, to really do it well, you want to be ahead of that. You already want to be thinking of those potential problems the season before, so to speak, the winter before you ever plant that seed in the ground. So you're ready to rock and roll when the time comes.
So something that comes to mind when thinking about the amount of information that you need to really start getting a sense of the what's going on the farm, and you said maybe working with the grower for a couple of years before you all start feeling comfortable with the direction that things are going in terms of recommendations. Do you have a set amount of hours or a sense of how much time you will need to spend with a particular grower, just kind of from an agronomist and business standpoint before you feel pretty comfortable with how things are going? Or does it just vary a lot from farm to farm?
It varies a lot because every individual farmer has his own strength and weaknesses. Some of them are very observant. Maybe they're very dialed in on their weed control already. So I don't try to have a cookie cutter um, single platform. I'm here on a consulting basis. When I work with farm, I'm here to help you work on the weaknesses to your system, not somebody else's. And so for me, it's identify the farmer as well. And this even goes to the conversation I've had with guys transitioning or thinking about transitioning to organic. And I look at their current workload and I go, realistically speaking, this is not going to physically work. You don't have enough hours in the day when you start adding up the hours it's going to take to do the mechanical weed control. I don't know that organic's a good fit for you. And I find that, if a farm thinks through those things before they just jump in, it really leads to a successful transition when the guys do transition. Um, for an example, I had a farm years ago, but they had a lot of drainage issues. And I pointed out to them that especially with organic weed control requiring additional passes over the field until they fix their drainage issue, it wasn't going to work for them to take that farm organically. They were setting themselves up for failure. And my recommendation is once you have tile, I'll help improve your system, but there's no point here without the tile. You're just setting yourself up for cropping disasters. Um, so to me, I look at every farm again to that unique strength, weaknesses, opportunities. What resources do you have? Let's utilize and maximize those first, and then I'll look to what's in the neighborhood. What can we pull on outside to help address your Liebig's law of the minimum, right? So whether it be an individual nutrient, maybe it's weed control. I want to address what your limiting factor is. There's no sense in adding more of what you don't need.
So thanks for sharing with us kind of the big picture approach here. We're going to start getting a little bit more detailed as we proceed with the conversation today. So let's say we start out with a pretty simple example. So you step onto a farm somewhere in the Midwest here, an organic farm here in the Midwest. Maybe they're doing a corn and soybean rotation. And most folks are probably going to have an idea of what their manure source is. Maybe even they have an idea of what their cover crop situation looks like. But let's kind of focus on manure. Um, Maybe a farmer would uh, be well, not necessarily stressed out, but maybe they would be concerned about the choice of which species of manure, where their manure is coming from. But let's just say we're trying to solve a simple issue of nutrient management, looking for nitrogen on a particular farm. How would you address this issue with a farmer if they have access to poultry bedding versus a turkey crumble versus, whatever other product might be available? How would you approach that just from a simple, we need nitrogen, maybe we need some phosphorus?
So in looking specific then to the crops, and the different types of manure, it's important to identify what manure type you have. And why I say that is it's interesting to me that oftentimes in the organic space, we just call manure, right? Swine manure, chicken manure, beef manure, dairy manure. Well, it's manure. Who cares? There is a huge variation to how that manure cycles in soils. So, for example, I have a higher ammonium based manure, such as hog manure or chicken manure. It's going to be very fast release. I've done side-by-side studies on strips with conventional fertilizers versus manure, not on organic farms, but on conventional farms. And in those scenarios, what I've discovered is some of these manures release almost as fast as urea. Well, how I manage a manure like that versus, let me say, more of a bed pack based manure source, which in some of my trials and what I've seen in the field can take upwards of almost 2 years to release the nitrogen out of those manure sources. How I manage those then is going to be very, very important if I want to rely upon that nitrogen over the course of the season. And then the timing of it. And we talk about fall nitrogen on the conventional side. And for the most part, we're very focused on making sure those soil temp levels are below 50 degrees, right? We don't want the nitrogen to be cycled with microbial base before our next season, before the crop is ready to take it in, the up and coming crop. So if manure being a nutrient source, nitrogen being there available to microbes, if you put that on pre 50 degrees, you're going to have the same problem. You're going to release it now this fall, and I'm going to put it and make it leachable, put it into a leachable form early in the spring before my crop's ready to uptake it. So timing of manure, it kind of goes to the 4 R's. I treat it like fertilizer. I make sure I have a good manure test that is representative of the manure that goes on there. I make sure that the rate is taking into consideration the previous crops, any other nutrient cycling, any other resources, nutrient sources going on that year. And then I look at the crop needs. What are realistic yield goals for my fields on my farm? We farm some dryland sand. I fertilize at a much different level there versus I do my irrigated acres. Because on a year-to-year basis, statistically speaking, water being my limited resource on my dryland acres, why would I fertilize for a crop that's going to require, let's say, a amount of rainfall that far exceeds what I normally get on a year-to-year basis? It doesn't make any financial sense to do so. So trying to really tailor that and treat that manure like fertilizer to me is very important to put together an economically sound crop system. Yes, we can always just throw on a ton of manure and cover up for the sin of not accounting for that. But especially with the value of manure now becoming more acknowledged across our industry, both conventionally and organically, the price of manure has gone up substantially in a lot of areas. It's not. I go back 20 years up here in my area, you could buy all the poultry manure and just pay for the hauling. Those days are behind us. The conventional side has re-acknowledged the value of manure, and they're willing to pay for it, is what I'm seeing in my area. So, organically speaking, not just being good stewards as far as with this resource, but also managing it in an economic return. I want to make sure we dial that in as close as possible to the actual needs of the up and coming crop. And then timing of it. So placement of it, I'll have guys that, have tried to put manure on and then they know they're going to plow. Well, if I'm going to plow 9-10 inches deep and I'm putting all that fertility down lower in the profile, I'm going to set myself up for failures because one, I'm taking that out of the aerobic layer of the soil. So I've just put my nutrient source, which is relying upon microbial breakdown outside the sphere of ideal microbial breakdown. And then two, it's also colder down there. So the level of microbial activity is going to be slower in the spring. So again, going to the 4R principles, just because it's manure doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to the right placement of it out in the field. And then in regards to different sources, I've studied and worked with a lot of different manure sources. And so I try to tailor the application of that relative to the release timing of it going out in the field. If I have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio manure, we'll maybe even apply that early summer after, let's say, a small grain crop to try and match that nitrogen release to meet up with my next year's corn crop, May and June, versus waiting till an application of November. And not having that breakdown period start in the fall. So how do you know that specific to each manure? That's some of the art to the science. And then I run into scenarios too where I have organic guys and they can get, let's say, hog manure, but their applicator or the guy that's selling it to them, well, he doesn't want to wait till November to put it out there. He's going to put it on in August after the small grain crop because his pit's too small. Well, how can we manage and try and capture that via maybe a cover crop? And what species do I put in that cover crop mix to try and capture as much of that nitrogen to carry it into my following year crop's needs to cover those crop needs? So those are all the little details that play together that are unique to each farm. And I try to tailor a system that's going to match then to perform for the up and coming years.
I think that's a great segue into the next section of getting more detailed here. So we have a few different soil tests that James has shared with us from his work. And so we're going to talk through some different situations on how, as an agronomist, you might approach fields that are in different states of functioning, let's say. So let me get these pulled up for you here. I'm going to share my screen so that you can follow along while we are chatting here. So this first soil test that you should be able to see any moment here is based off of a CRP field. So James and I were talking, it's fairly common to see growers in the Midwest transition CRP ground to organic relatively quickly. So James, how would you approach starting out with a grower who's transitioning a field from CRP to cropland under organic management?
So this actually has two different soil tests on it. One is a 5.9 pH, one has a 6.2. And one of the first things I try to address on a farm is the pH and the calcium levels of a soil. I could go into a whole session on the base cation ratio, saturation ratio theory of Ulbrich, and I've done multiple presentations to that regard. And what I would say is it's not specific to the ratios. There's a lot of misconceptions in that regard, but pH management and calcium levels are still very important in regards, especially not just to legumes. People think in terms of legumes, normally soybeans, alfalfa. We need a good pH level, good calcium levels to have good nodulation. But also, if you look at your Nitrobacter, Nitrosomos, your bacteria species that not just in conventional systems, but also in organic systems are an integral part of the nitrogen cycle. They function optimally when you get closer to a 7 pH. And so if I'm going to take advantage of and try and capture or gain as much out of my nitrogen cycle as possible and rely upon that, I want to make sure I'm setting that system up, the microbial base I'm going to rely on for success, that I'm creating an environment that's going to be conducive to them. So obviously talking in the context of what's in the farm's budget. Oftentimes, for the most part, when I work with farms, they're on a budgeted basis. So it's coming up with a 5-year, 7-year plan of how do we address, my and this particular CRP example isn't unusual from what I see, but normally they're pretty empty soils, not a lot of fertility, great soil health. And so to the point of like the misconception of soil health, go put a crop in there, and oftentimes I watch it fail if the guy doesn't address the fertility needs that the soil has. But that being said, what I start to do is there's no sense in fertilizing all of one nutrient for, let's say, 250 bushel corn. Let's pull that back. When I look at my nutrient budget, can I budget and put enough on for maybe 175, where I have enough money to put an expense towards all the different nutrients I'm going to need for that up and coming crop. Organically, I focus on the macronutrients first. Not that the micronutrients are not important, but the micronutrients are your gravy typically on the potatoes. The meat and the potatoes, that's going to still be your macronutrients. How are you addressing your nitrogen needs, your potassium needs, and your phosphorus needs? Once that's done, then I start looking at, sulfur requirement. Lime is very important, like I said, and more often than not, it's so in this particular scenario, I can tell you, we pulled in, he did a 2 ton of lime first year, and then we pulled in on soybeans. He had access to turkey manure. And so we ended up putting on 2 ton turkey manure in the scenario to cover his phosphorus, his potassium needs. Plus, we were adding nitrogen to that system to help accelerate the breakdown, trying to boost that carbon to nitrogen ratio to enable that residue to break down. So then when he's growing corn crop the following year, he's not going to suffer from a carbon penalty from all that residue breaking down from the previous CRP.
Very good. And I'm going to check, maybe Amanda can check the chat for us to see if there's any specific questions on this, but I'm not seeing any at the moment. So why don't we move on to the next soil test example, which is specifically, we're in a low fertility situation on this one here. So how, as an agronomist, might we approach this one?
So this one here, when you start looking at the different test levels, I've seen a number of different, I would say agronomists, but they're more or less salesmen for different inputs, and they'll come in and they'll try and fix this soil. Financially, you look at a soil test like this, there's not enough money in most farms' piggy banks to quote unquote fix this soil. So the question I'm asking is, how do I grow an adequate crop the next year? And what nutrients do I need to focus on? So in this particular scenario, he had a couple fields in alfalfa. Now that has a deeper taproot. I'm going to need, looking here, nitrogen's not really relevant, but I definitely need to address phosphorus and potassium needs up front. Organically speaking, there's multiple different dry fertilizers that can supplement for potassium, such as potassium sulfate, K-mag, potassium chloride, that can be used with restrictions. And then phosphorus-wise, that's a little bit more limited. There are some dry options. I find typically they're not overly effective. Particularly when you get to the rock phosphates. They don't break down very rapidly as your pH starts to go to 7. So most of the time for me, I'll look to even a low rate of manure going on in this scenario, let's say for alfalfa, in conjunction with some dry fertilizer to help compensate for the phosphorus and potassium needs. The other thing then, especially for alfalfa, I'll look to address is the sulfur requirement. Sulfur, especially for alfalfa, is needed to really help that plant produce high quality proteins. And typically I see not so much a huge yield advantage addressing sulfur on crop ground like this, but particularly with quality, the end quality going to the animal, that makes a big difference. And normally in conjunction with that, we'll boost a little bit of soluble calcium on a year-to-year basis as well. Corn and soybeans. Corn on this one's pretty easy. You're going to try and match your nitrogen requirement of your corn with what nitrogen you have out of your manure. And most of the time, if you do your math, it's going to more than supplement enough phosphorus and potassium out there for a good corn crop. Where it gets a little bit more challenging is, let's say I'm going to a soybean crop on a scenario like this. What I look to do in working with the farm is we try to boost the P and K levels on the corn ear, take advantage of needing the nitrogen, and can I set that up where there's enough carryover to maybe sustain a good soybean crop the following year. Normally phosphorus in the rotation is a little easier to sustain with manure. Potash is something I find that it's very hard to maintain that for the up and coming soybean crop for the following year, put enough on, because corn's such a heavy feeder of potash. So again, looking at that system as a whole, though, you want to address, and you can address multiple crops through maybe 1 or 2 applications of fertility. It doesn't necessarily have to be every season, but again, the fertility has to be found somewhere. Again, going to that misnomer of soil health, I've heard a number of different people claim, well, just get the healthy soil here and you're going to have a soil that's going to function just fine, even though your soil test levels are that low. And in that part of the conversation, I find there's a couple misconceptions. One isn't soil test in and of itself. Soil tests have 2 values. It's a snapshot of where I am today. And when I work with guys for a course of 5, 6, 7 years, what's very helpful is to get another snapshot down the road, let's say in 2 to 3, 4 years. Normally, I like to pull soil test every 2 to 3 years. But if I get a second snapshot in 3 years, what I get to see is the trajectory. Is the soil releasing more than what the crop is using? Fertilization in general, the principle of fertilization is to supplement what the soil can't provide. So soil fertility is not counter to nutrients coming available to a plant with better soil health. It's built on top of that. The principles work together. And so over time, as soils do increase, you need to start adapting and changing the amount of fertility you're adding to your system. I had the privilege of working just on a soil test basis with a grower that was trying to regenerate his soil without any inputs. And I watched him struggle for 6 years, putting cover crops, a wide, very, very good rotation of crops in. And despite his soil getting very healthy, terrible yields, and financially pretty much went out of business taking that approach. What I found is if you can improve your soil health and soil fertility together, it's not a 1+1 factor that equals 2. It actually ends up closer to like 5, 6, or 7 if you use both of those principles in synergy.
So before we move on to our next example, I wanted to kind of return to your comment earlier about how macronutrients are the potatoes, the meat and the potatoes, and then your micronutrients and your minor elements are kind of that gravy on top. So I wanted to see on this specific soil test, did you have any comments to make about some of those more minor elements that are listed here at the bottom, or do you wait for a grower to like basically send you a picture of a soybean plant that has some kind of unhealthy looking leaf characteristic before you go in for maybe a tissue test? How do you approach some of those micronutrient and so-called minor elements in a soil test like this?
So on the micronutrient side, I like to pull tissue test to verify if we have a deficiency. And then it's deficiency at what level of yield, because we look at, let's say, this current level on the soil test of your macros. Well, that's going to inhibit, and he's going to maybe get 30, 25 bushels of soybeans. Well, for 25 bushels of soybeans, granted, maybe your micro elements aren't very high, but there's plenty there for 25 bushels of soybeans. Normally, it's not until you actually are pushing that crop from a yield standpoint that you start running deficient on your micronutrients anyway. So it's kind of like putting the cart before the horse when you start focusing on your micronutrients prior to focusing on your macronutrients. The other thing you have to look at is individual species. They have different rooting systems, and every species is maybe more responsive to certain traces and less responsive to others. And so when I start looking at micronutrients, it's tailoring specific, because they are very expensive and they're restricted product on the organic side. I try to tailor a program that's going to look at the next year's crops needs and address those. What corn needs for micronutrients is very different than, let's say, soybeans. And a lot of that has to do with the rooting structure, the different compounds the individual plant makes. So it's not a cookie cutter, again, response. Otherwise, I mean, you can make it cookie cutter, which is just we'll get all of them high, but those fertility programs I see as being very, very expensive and unsustainable for most farms over time.
Yeah, thanks for addressing that for us. I'm going to pull in our next soil test, which this one is more of a high phosphorus condition. So let's talk through this one and how we might approach this field there's a few things going on, but high phosphorus should be one that jumps out at you.
So in this particular one, the high phos is something with especially or being organic and using manure and good manure management practices. I want to make sure I'm setting up a rotation where I'm not continuing to just over apply phosphorus. It's going to get to where I'm limited on how much manure I can apply as I continue to elevate high phos fields. This particular one is already at a concerning level. So in this particular case, I'm going to be looking into pull, let's say, some dry potassium fertilizer to supplement in that system. I don't want to be 100% reliant on just manure because manure is always going to bring phosphorus with it into the system. So both in building out a rotation, in selecting crops, um, and then taking advantage of a nutrient I have. So in this particular case, I have high phos. If I go to, let's say, a soybean or alfalfa, I can mine the phosphorus out of the system if I'm supplementing the other limiting factors, such as in this particular case, potassium, at an adequate level. So again, it goes to the opportunities of the farm. My cost to grow an alfalfa crop here versus the previous soil test where everything's low. Well, I have a significantly lower cost here. I already have more than enough phosphorus, and I actually want to mine some out of that system. So how do you strategically arrange a crop rotation then to manage the needs of the crop and to keep you in compliance for that particular soil and field? To go to the previous scenario, for example, which sometimes I see that, especially on new CRP, like we brought up with the first example, where everything's low, and I'll be working with a grower who's excited to transition to organic and just picked up the CRP piece, and I ask, well, what are you going to transition with? And in a lot of cases, I'll have somebody respond, well, alfalfa. Okay, well, I'm going to have a problem with that because alfalfa is an enormous nutrient remover and I'm already depleted. So why am I'm setting myself up from a fertility standpoint for failure trying to transition with alfalfa in a scenario like that, unless I have an adequate fertility resource that's cheap enough to compensate me for the nutrient needs that that crop's going to remove. So again, it's about tailoring to your farm the needs and the specific strengths you have to your farm, rather than saying, well, alfalfa is the best way to transition. In some respects, yes, but I wouldn't say in all scenarios.
So our final example that we have available today is what we would consider more of a maintenance program. So this farm has a soil, or this particular field has a soil that's pretty well functioning at this point. So we're looking to make recommendations more at a maintenance level than at a remediation type of level. So let's talk through how we would approach this one as well.
So this one here, we can see we're running a higher phosphorus. Potassium is good, and and again, potassium's one is very specific to the area. I've worked with soils here in the upper Midwest, had the opportunity to be part of sampling fields that had been sampled for 40 years, and they had alfalfa, a lot of alfalfa in their production. And after 40 years of alfalfa, the potassium level hadn't dropped at all. You could literally lay the soil test on top of each other. And again, that goes to the monitoring the trajectory of a soil test level. It was clear that his inherent soil type was releasing enough potassium to match all his crops needs. And so potassium was not a nutrient he was ever going to have to be concerned about. Now this particular soil, I've worked with it for this grower for over 10 years, and he typically runs a strong row crop and then alfalfa. And normally on the row crop years, we're building his macronutrient levels in his soil, his P and his K. And then typically on the backside of that, his alfalfa is mining them back out. And so you'll see the cyclical nature over time of the soil nutrient flow in and out of the system. So in this particular case, for soybeans, there's really not much to address other than perhaps maybe sulfur. Sulfur being a leachable nutrient, and boron are two that I take a very hard look at. Another one in the last 5, 6 years, I've really started to try and address with my organic clients is chloride, which has a bad name in the organic sphere, but is still a necessary crop nutrient. And most people do not test for it with their soil test. I've actually ran an extensive amount of chloride test, soil test, with all my clients, and my long-term organic guys who have not imported any chloride into their systems are actually very deficient. Um, and that's a common deficiency I would say I've seen across my entire client base. So one recommendation I would say have to anyone listening to this is if you have anions from a fertility standpoint in your system and they leach over time in a Midwest system, so sulfur, boron, chloride, nitrogen, of course, being an anion in the nitrate form, but all those leach. And so I would just recommend especially monitoring those because they do move over time within a couple years. Um, and again, if you're not addressing them, if you're not adding them back in some way in your system, oftentimes you'll see those levels over time drastically drop on an individual farm or in an individual field. So here, what would be important to me is to make sure that we're monitoring this particular soil in doing another test in 2 to 3 years and seeing where that soil level's at that time. In like this particular scenario, like I said, it drops drastically, very fast. It's a little bit lower CEC, and especially alfalfa being a heavy feeder, there's not the natural fertility, even though he has very good soil health. There's not enough of a natural fertility base to replace it fast enough. Um, that's kind of the misconception, I think, a little bit that all soils can equally replace every nutrient that a plant needs. And that's simply not true. It really depends on the parent material in your area, what nutrients are going to be cycling at what speed and coming available out of that parent material. Again, going to that North Dakota example, 40 years he grew alfalfa, didn't need to add any potassium. I've worked with soils in Minnesota. If you don't put potassium on within 2 to 3 years, you'll drive that right back down to those low levels that really create an unsustainable level for good crop production. So monitoring your levels, knowing your parent material, knowing the history of the farm becomes very valuable then in knowing what resources you have to be maintaining and replacing over time to maintain a good level of fertility. The other thing with potassium that's a little bit I've seen more, not so much in the organic space, although I've seen a few abuses of it, is potassium being a +1 charged ion will leach. People don't think about that, but it will leach, especially with excessive calcium applications. Um, there's a company that promotes very heavy liming in my area, and I've seen guys that put on excessive rates repeatedly on a regular basis. And I've seen them drive their soil test levels of potassium down to where they're at a 92, 94 base saturation calcium. Their potassium is at a, 0.4%, 50, 35 part per million. And once you've done that, once you've replaced your potassium with colloid, it gets very hard to push potassium back onto your colloid because it's only a +1 charged ion. Calcium being +2 is going to want to hang on to that charge site. And so it's hard to rebuild your potassium levels if you abuse it in that form with excessive liming, excessive calcium applications over time. So I have a number of guys that we again, calcium being a necessary nutrient and especially soluble calcium, something you really want to address on a regular basis. I work with my growers. We use things like eggshells, gypsum. Now, there's a number of different options out there for calcium. But again, we try to do it on a metered basis to make sure that we're not, especially with potassium, losing a valuable resource by just over applying a different one.
And my, how the time flies. It is already 10 till. So before we start our wrap up, I wanted to give James a final question from me before we move on. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. We can always come back to these soil tests if we need to take a look in a little bit. But I wanted to kind of end our questions today with the question of what do organic advisors and agronomists often get wrong in your experience? What are some mistakes that we can avoid when it comes to making good recommendations to the growers that we're working with?
As far as organic advisors, I think because we work, especially agronomists that work in the conventional space as well, we get the pressure that we need to solve this grower's problem immediately. And my biggest advice to other consultants is don't put that pressure on yourself. We don't have a lot of tools in our toolbox to pigeonhole like we do on the conventional side. And that's where you really have to, if you're working with growers, focus with them on long-term planning. I probably am beating a dead horse saying that, but most solutions on the organic side, it's cost prohibitive to pigeonhole it, pigeonhole a solution. It's much more economical and easier to do on a long-term basis. Um, and that includes too, I would say one other key thing I've seen a lot of organic nutrient consultants, if I can call it that, get in trouble with is, and that's why I like to take a more holistic approach looking at a farm system and their challenges, is there's no use, there's no purpose to fertilize weeds better. And so if you're working with a grower who's struggling with weed control, oftentimes I will work with them on a weed control side of it and setting up either with finessing the tools that they have in their toolbox, adding tools to their toolbox, helping them, because otherwise, if I just pour more fertility out there, I'm just growing bigger weeds. And what good is that to my grower? And I've seen organic or organic consultants or consultants in general get a bad rap in a scenario where didn't matter what you recommended for fertilizer, the weeds were just going to get it. And that's not really fair to a consultant. So watch out for that trap. And some of that comes from conventional growers that have transitioned to organic because they're still thinking too pigeonholed, that my problem is just a fertility. I just need to get a different nutrient out there and it's going to solve my weed problem. And I will tell you that, yes, there's different soil dynamics that play into who lives and who dies as far as weed species. But I would say inherently, if you have a lot of seed, you are going to have weeds. And it's not an individual nutrient problem for the most part.
Appreciate that, James. We have time for one or two questions, and there is a question in the chat that's a little bit more of a disease-related question. And Justin asks if you have any thoughts or observations on southern rust at this time.
So I have the benefit in being in the upper Midwest. We had southern rust pretty bad through the area late in the season. It blows up from the south, moves up with weather systems. So for the most part, most of the growers here did not have um, yield cutting disease levels, or the disease was so late. Test weight was hurt a little bit, maybe 54, 55, but it wasn't a drastic reduction of either yield or quality. Further to the south, I would look at, obviously, and again, this goes to the holistic view on looking at a farm, but also seed variety, plant varieties, look at resistance levels in the varieties that you're selecting to grow. There's multiple different diseases like that one where tar spot is another one that's in our area. Looking at disease resistant factors in its individual varieties becomes very important. Again, at the end of the season, it's one thing to have the poor harvest come from a bad recommendation of fertility. But again, if your grower selected a variety that was susceptible to a specific disease problem in your area and it's the disease that robbed the yield, well, again, you're going to get the blame, but it's not really anything related to fertility. So again, I like to work with my growers, again, big picture, varieties, rotation, all those aspects I try to pull in when I'm putting together fertility recommendations. Not that it's specific to fertility, but they're not going to have any advantage to looking at the fertility unless they're addressing all the weak links of a chain.
Thanks so much, James. We really appreciate you being on the call with us today and sharing some of your experiences with us. So, we have come to the end of our time for this episode of the Organic Advisor Call Series. So, just before you leave your desks today, we do have an evaluation for you. It'll take you no more than 60 seconds. Look in the chat for that. Amanda has dropped the link to the survey in that chat for you. And then just to preview you for next time. So this is our 6th Organic Advisor call for this 2025 series, but we'll hope to see you for the next episode, which is coming up on Tuesday, October 28th. And this is assuming that the government is back open at that time, because our topic will be understanding the RUSL 2 program for organic grain farms, the RUSLE 2. And that will depend on the NRCS being available to provide an organic expert to talk us through that. So hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll be back open and ready to go for that one. And I will be seeing you as a fellow participant on that call instead of a guest host. But until then, we wish you a safe and bountiful harvest, and we really appreciate seeing you all on the call today. So enjoy the rest of your day. I hope some of you are getting rain. We sure need some rain here in Indiana. It's very, very dry here. But thanks again for being on the call today, and make sure you fill out that survey.